They weren't trying to kill her. No. What they had in mind was so much worse. The rope groaned like a dying man's last wish, a sound that cut through the dead still air of a town holding its breath. Clara Mayfield's feet dangled, just kissing the dust, her toes twitching for a hold on something solid. On the ground. On a life that was slipping away. Her hands were bound tight behind her back, the rope biting into her wrists, but she didn't struggle. She hadn't screamed, hadn't pleaded. That was her sin, wasn't it? She endured things too quietly for a world that only understood loud pain. Around her, the whole town had gathered. Not a soul moved to stop it. Sheriff Amos Finch stood off to the side, studying the brim of his hat like it held the secrets to the universe. Preacher Alden was there, his face a mask of pious sorrow, as if this whole ugly affair was God's will and not the bitter cruelty of men. Even her own kin, the Mayfields, watched with eyes as hard and unforgiving as the land they owned. They lifted her up before everyone, a spectacle of shame. This is what becomes of a woman who can't do the one thing God put her on this earth for. The noose wasn't the kind that snaps a neck. It was a choker's knot, tied just loose enough to let her breathe in slivers, to scrape the air from her lungs in ragged, desperate gas. Just enough to brand her failure into the wind for all to see. Silas Mayfield, her late husband, Caleb's older brother, stood with his boots planted firm, his shadow long and sharp in the afternoon sun. He was the architect of this misery. He quoted scripture in a voice that sounded like fire and ash. "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire," he boomed, and the crowd rustled, a few murmuring amen, because it was safer than staying silent. It was always safer to agree with a man like Silas. Clara's vision started to swim. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single monstrous eye staring at her, judging her. Her dress, the blue one Caleb had loved, billowed in the dry wind. She remembered the doctor's words after the fifth time, the fifth little ghost she'd carried and lost. He'd looked at his hands, unable to meet her eyes, and said the words that had signed her death warrant. "The soil is barren, Clara. Nothing will grow here." She remembered Caleb walking out of the room before the sentence was even finished. She remembered his mother refusing to touch her afterward, as if her grief, her emptiness, was a disease you could catch. The Mayfields didn't just want a child, they wanted an heir, a strong son to carry their name, their brand, their legacy. All Clara gave them were tiny graves and quiet apologies. Then Caleb died, a stupid, senseless accident, a spooked herd down by the riverbed, his screams swallowed by the thunder of 1,000 hooves. The family buried him quick and turned their grief, sharp and pointed, directly at her, as if her empty womb had somehow called that stampede down upon him. It was easier to blame her than to blame fate. Sheriff Finch had tried to talk them out of this. For a whole afternoon, he'd argued. But Silas had the town in his pocket, and the sheriff was a man who valued peace above justice. "A public humbling," he'd called it, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. "It'll keep the peace, Clara." Peace, that's what they called it when a woman was strung up to choke on her own silence while the sun bled out across the horizon. That's what they called it when they finally cut her down, and she didn't even have the decency to collapse. Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. That's what truly broke them. Not her pain, but her refusal to show it the way they wanted. Silas spat in the dust near her feet, his face contorted in a sneer of righteous disgust. "God has judged you, Clara Mayfield. You are cast out." She looked up at him, her lips split, a halo of purple bruising already forming around her throat, and she said nothing. Her silence was a scream they couldn't hear, and it terrified them. She stumbled away from the gallows, a ghost haunting her own life. The streets emptied as she passed. Doors clicked shut. Curtains were drawn. Mrs. Langston, the town's chief gossip and moral authority, clutched her Bible and whispered loud enough for Clara to hear, "It would have been kinder to let her swing." At the edge of town, as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the jagged mountains, she finally fell. The world went dark. The dust felt cold against her cheek, and she thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is peace. But then she heard boots, heavy, steady, not rushing, just there. A shadow fell over her, A man knelt down, his worn coat brushing against her arm. He didn't touch her, not at first. He just looked, his face unreadable in the deepening twilight. Then without a word, he shrugged off his coat and laid it over her like a shroud. Or maybe a blanket. He had eyes the color of a stormy sky and a face that looked like it was carved from old wood and hard miles. He said nothing, asked nothing. He just scooped her up as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry sticks and carried her away into the night. She didn't know if she was being saved or kidnapped. At that moment, she wasn't sure there was a difference. The world came back smelling of wood smoke and old leather. Clara opened her eyes to the low, flickering light of a fire dancing against the walls of a small, one-room cabin. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound. But in here, the air was still and warm. She was lying on a narrow cot, the man's rough coat still draped over her. She tried to sit up, and a searing pain shot through her throat. She choked back a gasp. "Coffee's on!" The voice came from the hearth. It was deep and quiet, like stones rolling at the bottom of a river. A silhouette shifted, tall and broad-shouldered. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. He turned his head just enough for her to see his profile in the firelight. "You can rest. Ain't no one gonna find you here." Her own voice was a dry, broken whisper. "Where?" "My land," he said, his back still mostly to her. "Name's Jed Callahan. Don't ask how I found you. Just know you were about to die where you lay." His words were blunt, holding no pity, only fact. She didn't have the strength to argue or to ask more questions. She simply nodded once and let her eyes drift shut, falling back into a darkness that felt, for the first time, blessedly empty. The next time she woke, sunlight was streaming through a grimy window pane. The fire was still crackling, and on a small crate next to the cot sat a tin mug of black coffee. Next to it, a piece of jerky and a hard biscuit. The man, Jed, was gone, but on the floor by the door was a note scrawled on a piece of scrap wood. "Stay, heal, more coffee in the pot." It wasn't a request, it was a command. The days that followed blurred into a quiet routine. Clara learned that Jed Callahan didn't talk much. His silence wasn't cold or angry like the silence of the Mayfields. It was a different kind of quiet. It was spacious. It gave a person room to breathe, to simply be. He lived a simple life. 2 horses, a handful of chickens, and a windmill that groaned a steady rhythmic complaint against the wind. He had a nasty scar across the back of his right hand, and he cooked his morning eggs with a kind of intense focus that made you think breakfast was the most important event of the day. She never asked why he lived so far out, a ghost on the edge of a world that had forgotten him. She didn't ask why he spent so much time staring at the horizon, as if waiting for someone to return, or making sure no one was coming. Maybe she already knew the answer. Maybe he saw the same brand of loneliness in her that he'd buried deep inside himself. On the 5th morning, her voice finally felt like her own again. She found him outside, splitting wood with powerful, efficient swings of his axe. The sound echoed in the crisp morning air. "You going to ask what I did?" she said, her voice still raspy. Jed didn't stop. The axe bit into the wood with a satisfying crack. Thwack. Crack. "Don't need to," he grunted, hoisting another log onto the block. "They hanged me," she said, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. Thwack. "I saw." The casualness of his admission sent a shiver down her spine. He'd been there? He'd watched. They said I failed God." He finally stopped. He set the axe down and leaned against the chopping block, wiping sweat from his brow at the back of his sleeve. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unnervingly clear. "Some folks speak for God too easy," he said, his voice low. "Makes me think they ain't listening close enough." He picked the axe back up and went back to work. The conversation, for him, apparently over. But for Clara, something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of ice around her heart. That evening, a chill wind swept down from the mountains. Jed came inside and, without a word, pulled an old heavy wool shawl from a wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. It smelled of cedar and something else. Maybe tobacco, maybe just time. He handed it to her. She took it with both hands, the rough texture a comfort against her skin. "Thank you. Winter comes early out here, he said, staring into the fire. "Cole, don't wait on no one." Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, swirling in the darkness like tiny ghosts. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but he had given her coffee. He had given her a blanket. He had given her a place to heal. And she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he was the first person in a long time who wasn't trying to take anything from her. The next morning, she asked if she could feed the chickens. He just nodded. The day after that, she swept the porch clean of the accumulating snow. He didn't comment, but later she saw him out by the barn, repairing the back gate. He'd left a hammer and a small box of nails on a nearby stump. It was an invitation, a test, a gesture that said more than 100 words ever could. That was how they learned to talk, not with voices, but with actions. He watched her hum to herself, a tune she didn't even realize she knew, while stirring a pot of beans. She watched his hands, thick and calloused, expertly mend a broken leather strap, and she knew those hands had seen things. War, maybe. Heartbreak, definitely. The news, of course, eventually trickled out of town. Riders passing by would have seen the smoke from his chimney. Mrs. Langston, no doubt, was having a field day. "She's holed up with that hermit Callahan." Clara could almost hear her whispering over tea. "The devil finds his own, you know." But back at the ranch, Clara knew none of this. All she knew was the quiet rhythm of the days. The way Jed would always leave her the last biscuit. The way he'd fixed a hole in her boot without her ever asking. The simple, profound relief of waking up to a silence that didn't accuse her. One night, sitting by the fire, she stared into the flames and the words just came out, unbidden. "I was going to name him Jonah." It was a whisper, barely disturbing the air. The second one, "He made it almost 5 months." Jed didn't speak. He just reached for the fire poker and nudged a glowing log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He stared into the embers for a long moment. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, "Strong name." The fire crackled, and it sounded like something inside her breaking open. Not falling apart, but finally letting some light in. She told him everything then, not all at once, but in pieces, like laying out the shards of a broken pot. The hope, the blood, the shame, the empty ache that never went away. And Jed just sat there listening. He listened like it mattered. He listened like her story was a thing of value, not a mark of her failure. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't dream of ropes or graves. She dreamed of wild horses running free under a vast open sky, and the smell of wood smoke felt like a promise. The next morning, she stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in his shawl, and took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. Jed was by the fence, staring east toward the rising sun. He heard her and turned, and for the very first time he smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was a small, slow curve of his lips. But it was enough. It was more than enough. But as she stood there, feeling the first stirrings of something that might one day be hope, her eyes caught on something near the fence line, half hidden by a patch of stubborn, snow-dusted weeds. 3 small wooden markers pushed into the frozen earth. They were old, worn smooth by wind and rain. No names were carved on them. Just 3 stark, silent crosses. Jed had spoken for God. But who had he spoken for here? Who was buried on his land? And why had he never mentioned them? The cabin suddenly felt a little colder, the silence a little heavier. The 3 wooden crosses became a silent question between them. They stood stark against the snow, a constant reminder that this quiet man, this savior, had his own ghosts. Clara found herself watching him more closely, looking for clues in the way he moved, in the rare moments his guard seemed to drop. He never went near the graves. It was as if that corner of his land didn't exist for him, a blind spot in his memory. One afternoon, while he was out checking his traps, a bitter wind rattling the cabin door, Clara gave in to the gnawing curiosity. She pulled on the heavy shawl and her mended boots and walked out to the fence line. The snow crunched under her feet, the only sound in the vast, white silence. Up close, the markers were even more weathered than she'd thought. They weren't professionally made. They were rough, hand-carved, the work of a man with a knife in a deep-seated need. She knelt, her fingers brushing the snow away from the base of the nearest one. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. What was she expecting to find? Names? Dates? She ran her gloved hand over the rough wood, feeling the grain, the splinters, and that's when her fingers caught on something. Not a carving, but a notch. A deep, deliberate cut near the bottom. She checked the second marker. It had one too. And the third. They were identical. Not memorials, they were markers of a different kind. Trophies, maybe, or warnings. A cold dread, colder than the snow she was kneeling in, crept up her spine. These weren't the graves of children. They weren't the graves of a lost family. The feeling in her gut was primal, certain. These were the graves of men, and the man who had saved her had put them there. When Jed returned at dusk, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder, he found her sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, the poker held tight in her hands. The cabin was filled with a new kind of tension. He stopped just inside the door, sensing the change. He looked from her pale, set face to the poker she was gripping like a weapon. "You went out there," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't look at him. "Who are they, Jed?" He dropped the rabbits on the floor with a soft thud. He walked over to the hearth, his movements slow, deliberate. He took the poker from her unresisting hand and set it back in its stand. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, staring into the fire he'd built. "Men who needed burying," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Did you?" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I did what was necessary," he said, still not turning. "They came onto my land. They thought because I was alone I was weak. They thought they could take what they wanted. My wife, Mercy, she was here." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with a storm so dark it stole the breath from her lungs. "They were wrong, and I made sure they never made that mistake again." The story spilled out of him then, told in that same clipped, factual tone. 3 drifters years ago. They'd seen his homestead, seen his wife. They'd come back when he was gone. He'd returned to find Mercy beaten, terrified, but alive. He'd tracked them for 2 days. He hadn't brought them back for the sheriff. He had brought them back for his own kind of justice. A justice that ended with 3 holes in the ground and 3 rough-hewn markers. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. The man who had shown her such quiet kindness was a killer. He had taken 3 lives with the same hands that had mended her boots and handed her a warm cup of coffee. But the fear she expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, a strange, unsettling understanding began to dawn. He wasn't a monster. He was a protector. He had protected his home, his wife, and now he was protecting her. The thought was both terrifying and comforting. "The sheriff?" she whispered. "The sheriff knows better than to ask questions he don't want the answers to," Jed said. "Some things are better left buried." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You afraid of me, Clara?" She thought of Silas Mayfield's smug, cruel face. She thought of the townspeople who had watched her choke, their eyes blank and pitiless. She thought of the rope burning her skin. She looked at this man, this killer, who had shown her more decency than any of those righteous folk ever had. "No," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "I'm not afraid of you." A silent pact was made in that moment. His secret was safe with her, and in return, his protection was hers. The thaw came, both outside and in. The snow melted, revealing the hard, brown earth beneath. And something in Clara began to thaw, too. She had survived. More than that, she was beginning to live. She started a small garden near the cabin, her hands sinking into the cool, damp soil. Jed watched her, a silent guardian. He never mentioned the graves again, and neither did she. They were a part of the landscape now, a part of his story, and therefore, a part of hers. But you can't outrun the past forever. Eventually it comes knocking. In their case, it rode into town on the back of a horse. The need for supplies grew unavoidable. Flour, salt, coffee. They couldn't stay isolated forever. "I have to go," she told Jed one morning, her voice firm. He just nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm going with you." The ride into town was tense. The wind seemed to whisper warnings at their backs. As the familiar buildings came into view, Clara's stomach twisted into a knot of cold dread. She could feel the old shame, the old fear, trying to claw its way back up her throat. But then she felt Jed's presence beside her, solid and unwavering, and she straightened her shoulders. She would not let them see her break. Not again. The moment they rode onto the main street, a hush fell over the town. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People froze, their eyes locking on to her. It was like she was a ghost who decided to come back and haunt them in broad daylight. She dismounted, her movements deliberate, refusing to hurry. Jed stood by her side, his hand resting casually on the hilt of the pistol at his hip. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. Old Mr. Garrett at the general store couldn't meet her eyes. He tallied up her purchases, his hands trembling slightly. As she stepped back out onto the boardwalk, a wad of tobacco spit landed in the dust just inches from her boot. A young boy, no older than 15, stood across the street, his face a mask of learned contempt. He spat again, a look of defiance in his eyes. Before Jed could even move, Clara spoke, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "Your mother taught you better manners than that, didn't she, Jimmy?" The boy flushed red and scurried away. A few people on the boardwalk looked down, suddenly ashamed. Clara had found her voice, and it was sharper than they remembered. But the real confrontation was yet to come. As they were tying their supplies to their saddles, a figure emerged from the saloon. Silas Mayfield. He froze when he saw her, his face darkening like a thunderhead. He strode toward them, his boots thudding on the wooden planks. "You've got a hell of a nerve showing your face here," he snarled, stopping a few feet away. "A barren whore hiding out with a killer." His eyes flicked to Jed, then back to Clara. Jed took a single step forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but Clara put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "I'm not barren, Silas," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I was grieving, and I'm not a whore." Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're nothing. You're a stain on my brother's name. That land he left you, it belongs to the Mayfields, and I'm going to get it back. I filed a petition with the county judge. You forfeited your rights when you failed to give Caleb an heir. You'll be left with nothing, just like you are." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You should have swung. I should have pulled the rope myself." That's when Jed moved. It was so fast, Clara barely saw it. One moment he was by her side, the next he had Silas by the throat, slamming him back against a support post. Silas's eyes bulged, his face turning a mottled purple. "You will never," Jed hissed, his voice dangerously low. "Speak to her again. You will never come near her again. And if you try to take one single thing that belongs to her, the last thing you will ever see is my face. Do you understand me?" He let go. Silas collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, clutching his throat. Jed looked down at him, his expression one of pure, cold contempt. "Stay away from us." He turned, took Clara's arm, and helped her onto her horse. They rode out of town without looking back, leaving Silas choking in the dust and the entire town as their silent, stunned witnesses. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet before a war. Silas Mayfield had made a promise, but so had Jed Callahan, and Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that only one of them would be able to keep it. The legal notice arrived a week later, delivered by a reluctant Sheriff Finch. He wouldn't look Clara in the eye, just handed her the papers and muttered something about the law having to take its course. It was all there in black and white. Silas Mayfield, citing an old and rarely used inheritance clause, was formally challenging her right to the land Caleb had left her. The hearing was set for the end of the month. "He can't win," Clara said, tracing the harsh legal script with her finger. The paper felt tainted. Jed took it from her and read it, his expression unreadable. "Men like Silas don't care about winning," he said, his voice grim. "They care about destroying. This isn't about land. It's about punishing you for surviving." He crumpled the notice in his fist and tossed it into the fire. Let him try. In the days leading up to the hearing, a change came over Jed. The quiet, watchful man became something harder, sharper. He spent hours cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and economical. He walked the perimeter of his property every morning and every evening, his eyes scanning the horizon not for memories, but for threats. He was no longer just a man living in isolation. He was a sentry guarding a fortress. Clara, for her part, felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. Silas wanted to put her on trial again, to humiliate her in a courtroom instead of on a gallows. But this time, she wouldn't be silent. This time, she would fight back. On the morning of the hearing, she put on the blue dress, the one she'd worn that day. She had painstakingly mended every tear, washed out every stain. It was no longer a shroud of her shame. It was her armor. When Jed saw her, he stopped, his hand on the cabin door. He didn't say a word, but his eyes told her everything. He understood. The courthouse was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the second act of Clara Mayfield's public destruction. Silas sat at a table with his lawyer, a slick-looking man from the city. He smirked when Clara and Jed walked in, a look of triumphant cruelty on his face. The judge was a tired old man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Silas's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of Clara as a defective, faithless wife who had failed in her sacred duty. He called her barrenness a sign of God's displeasure. He brought up witnesses. Mrs. Langston took the stand and spoke of Clara's unnatural silence and lack of proper grief. A former Mayfield ranch hand testified that Caleb had been deeply unhappy in the months before his death, implying Clara was to blame for that too. It was a character assassination, brutal and methodical. Through it all, Clara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the judge. She refused to look at Silas, refused to give him the satisfaction of her tears or her anger. Jed sat right behind her, a mountain of silent menace. His presence alone kept the whispers in the gallery to a minimum. Then it was her turn. She didn't need a lawyer. She stood up and walked to the stand, her steps steady. The judge looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Mayfield, do you have a response to these allegations?" She looked out, not at the judge, not at Silas, but at the faces of the townspeople, the ones who had watched her hang. "My name is Clara Mayfield," she began, her voice quiet but clear, ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. "My husband Caleb was a good man. We loved each other. We wanted a family more than anything in this world." She paused, taking a breath. "I carried 5 children. I felt them move inside me. I named each one of them in my heart, and I buried each one of them. You call me barren. I call myself a mother who has known more grief than any of you can imagine. You say I failed in my duty. Does a farmer fail when a drought takes his crop? Does a shepherd fail when a wolf takes his flock? My body was a garden that suffered a blight. It was my tragedy. It was not my crime." She finally turned her eyes to Silas. "You speak of my husband's land. You speak of legacy, but you know nothing of the man my husband was. Caleb would be horrified by what you are doing, by what you did. This isn't about his honor. This is about your greed and your cruelty. You want to punish me for not being what you wanted me to be. But I am no longer your family's property to judge or to break. The land is mine, by law and by love. But you can have it. I don't want it. I don't want anything that has the stain of the Mayfield name on it." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Silas's jaw had dropped. His lawyer was shuffling his papers at a complete loss. Clara had done the one thing they never expected. She had surrendered the prize, but in doing so, she had claimed a victory they couldn't comprehend. She had freed herself. She stepped down from the stand and walked out of the courthouse, Jed right behind her. She didn't wait for the judge's ruling. She didn't need to. As they mounted their horses, she felt lighter than she had in years. The battle was over. But as they rode out of town, a man rushed out of the sheriff's office, waving them down. "Sheriff wants to see you, Callahan," he yelled. "It's Silas Mayfield. He's gone missing." Clara's blood ran cold. She looked at Jed. His face was a mask of stone. He'd been in the courthouse with her the whole time. He couldn't have had anything to do with it. Could he? Then she remembered the night before. He'd been gone for hours saying he was checking the trap lines. He'd come back long after midnight, mud on his boots, his expression dark and unreadable. A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. Sheriff Finch looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. His office smelled of stale coffee and desperation. He was last seen leaving the courthouse, Finch said, rubbing his tired eyes. He was furious, shouting about being cheated, stormed over to the saloon, had a few drinks, then nothing. Vanished. He looked from Clara to Jed, his gaze lingering on Jed. You two were the last people to have a disagreement with him. We were in your courthouse, Jed said, his voice flat, in front of the whole town. I know that, Finch snapped, his frustration boiling over. But people are talking, saying you threatened him. I told him to stay away from her, Jed corrected, his tone icy. That's not a threat. That's a promise. The sheriff sighed, slumping in his chair. Look, Jed, I know your history. I know you're not a man to be crossed. Just stay on your land. Don't give anyone a reason to point a finger. I'll form a search party in the morning. They left the office and rode home under a sky bruised with the colors of sunset. The silence in the air was thick with unspoken questions. Clara wanted to ask him. She needed to ask him. Did you go out last night? Where did you go? But the words wouldn't come. She was afraid of the answer. What if he said yes? What would that make him? What would that make her? An accomplice? A beneficiary of murder? The next few days were a special kind of hell. The search party combed the hills and the riverbanks. Riders passed by Jed's property, their eyes filled with suspicion, but no one dared cross his fence line. The town was buzzing with rumor and speculation. Silas had run off in shame. Silas had been ambushed by rivals. Or the most popular theory, the quiet hermit Callahan had finally snapped and made good on his promise. Clara and Jed moved around each other in the small cabin like ghosts. The easy silence they had built was gone, replaced by a tense, fragile quiet that could be shattered by a single wrong word. One afternoon, Clara was in the barn gathering eggs. The sunlight streamed through the gaps in the wooden planks, illuminating swirling dust motes. Her hand brushed against a loose floorboard near the back wall. Curiosity, or maybe some darker instinct, made her pry it up. Underneath, in the cool, dark earth, was a small, hollowed-out space, and inside that space was a leather pouch. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a collection of small, grim objects, a tarnished silver button, a pocket knife with a chipped pearl handle, and a heavy, ornate belt buckle, cast in the shape of a longhorn steer. She recognized it instantly. It was the buckle Silas Mayfield had been wearing in the courthouse. Her breath hitched in her throat. She dropped the pouch as if it were on fire. It was true, Jed had done it. He had left the hearing, gone out under the cover of darkness, found Silas, and killed him. These were his trophies, just like the notches on the wooden graves. He wasn't just a protector, he was a predator, a man who collected souvenirs from the men he buried. She stumbled out of the barn, gasping for air, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She saw him by the corral, mending a saddle, his movements as calm and methodical as ever. How could he be so calm? How could he live with what he'd done? He looked up and saw her, and his brow furrowed in concern at the look on her face. He started walking toward her. Clara? What is it? Fear, sharp and blinding, finally ripped through her. She backed away, her hands held up as if to ward him off. Stay away from me, she whispered, the words ragged. He stopped, his expression hardening as he understood. You were in the barn. It wasn't a question. You killed him, she accused, her voice rising. You murdered him, and you buried him somewhere, and you kept a piece of him. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, his face carved from stone, letting her accusations hang in the air between them. He was a rabid dog, Clara, he said, his voice dangerously low. He was never going to stop. He would have hounded you until you had nothing left. I did what the law was too weak to do. I put him down. That's not justice, she cried, tears streaming down her face. That's vengeance. Sometimes, he said, taking a slow step toward her. They're the same thing. He hurt you. He was going to keep hurting you. I wasn't going to let that happen. She was trapped between the man who had saved her life and the murderer he had become to protect it. Her world was tilting on its axis. Everything she thought she knew about him, about herself, was a lie. She had fled a town of monsters only to take refuge with another one. Just then, they heard the sound of approaching horses. A lot of them. Sheriff Finch was riding toward them, and behind him was a posse of at least a dozen armed men from the town. One of them was pointing toward the river. Finch looked grim. "We found him, Jed," he called out, his voice heavy with dread. "Washed up downstream. Looks like he fell in the river and hit his head." He paused, his eyes locking onto Jed. "But his boots are missing, and his pockets are empty. This wasn't an accident." The posse of men behind him shifted, their hands moving toward their guns. They weren't there to investigate. They were there for a different kind of justice. Clara looked from their hard, accusatory faces to Jed's cold, defiant one. And in that moment, she felt a strange, terrifying flutter low in her belly. A flicker of movement that had nothing to do with fear. It was something else. Something impossible. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or a trick of her own panicked body. But then it came again, a tiny, insistent pulse. The doctor in town had called her barren. Silas had called her an empty vessel. The whole world had judged her and found her worthless because her body was a wasteland. But they were wrong. The sickness she'd been feeling in the mornings, the strange fatigue, it wasn't grief, it wasn't illness, it was life. Against all odds, in the middle of all this death and darkness, a seed had taken root in the blighted garden. She was pregnant, and the father of her child was a killer who was about to be torn apart by a mob. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Pregnant. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of her mind. A miracle growing inside a nightmare. She looked at Jed, who stood between her and the posse, a lone wolf facing down a pack. They saw a killer. She saw the father of her child. "It's over, Jed," Sheriff Finch said, his voice strained. "Come with me peacefully." "He's not going anywhere," Clara said. The words came out before she even thought them, strong and clear. Every man turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. She walked forward, stepping to Jed's side, placing a hand on his arm. It was a gesture of solidarity, a declaration. "Silas Mayfield was a cruel man," she said, her eyes sweeping over the posse, meeting the gaze of men who had stood by and watched her humiliation. "He threatened me. He threatened our home. If he stumbled and fell into a river in a drunken rage, then that's God's justice, not yours." "That's not for you to decide, ma'am," one of the men growled, a Mayfield cousin by the name of Elias. "Callahan threatened him in front of the whole town." "And the whole town watched while Silas strung me up," Clara shot back, her voice like ice. "Where was your justice then? Where was your courage?" The men shuffled uncomfortably. They had no answer for that. Jed looked down at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Surprise? Gratitude? Sheriff Finch held up a hand. "That's enough. I'm taking him in for questioning. It's the law." "No," Jed said simply. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The word hung in the air like a drawn blade. "This is my land. You are not taking me from it." The standoff was reaching its breaking point. Elias Mayfield and a few others started to dismount, their intentions clear. They weren't interested in the law. This was personal. This was about family pride and vengeance. And that's when Clara played the only card she had left. "You can't," she said, her voice dropping, but carrying with a desperate intensity. "You can't take him. I need him." She looked directly at Sheriff Finch, letting the tears she'd been holding back finally fall. "I'm with child." A collective gasp went through the posse. It was as if she'd thrown a bolt of lightning into their midst. The barren woman? Pregnant? The news was so shocking, so utterly unbelievable, that it stopped them dead in their tracks. They stared at her flat stomach, then at Jed, their minds struggling to process the information. Mrs. Langston, who had apparently tagged along to witness the drama, let out a scandalized squawk. "It's the devil's work," she shrieked. "She's a witch, and he's her familiar." The accusation, as insane as it was, found fertile ground in their fear and confusion. The narrative shifted instantly. This wasn't a murder investigation anymore. It was a witch hunt. Clara hadn't just gotten pregnant. She'd used some dark magic to do it, seducing this killer into protecting her, cursing Silas from afar. Sheriff Finch, seeing he'd lost control of the situation, tried to regain order. "That's enough of that nonsense, Prue," he yelled. But it was too late. The fear had turned to righteous fury. "We need to cleanse this land," Elias Mayfield roared, his face red with conviction. "Burn them out." Jed pushed Clara behind him. "Get in the house," he ordered, his voice a low command. "Lock the door." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Clara ran, her heart pounding. She slammed the heavy cabin door shut and dropped the thick wooden bar into place just as the first gunshot rang out. The siege had begun. Through the grimy window, she watched a scene from a nightmare unfold. Jed moved with a terrifying efficiency. He wasn't a farmer playing at being a soldier. He was a natural predator in his element. He used the corral, the barn, the woodpile as cover, firing with deadly accuracy. He wasn't shooting to kill, she realized. He was aiming for shoulders, for legs. He was disabling them, not executing them, but they were shooting to kill him. Bullets ripped through the cabin walls, splintering wood, shattering the precious few jars she had on a shelf. She huddled on the floor, her hands protectively over her belly, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She prayed for the life inside her and for the life of the killer fighting to protect them both. The hours blurred into a cacophony of gunfire, shouting, and the terrified whinnying of horses. As dusk began to fall, a profound, gut-wrenching pain seized her. It was sharp, insistent. Her water broke. The baby was coming. Now, in the middle of a gunfight, with a mob outside trying to kill its father. She screamed, a sound of pure agony and terror. Outside, the shooting momentarily stopped. "What was that?" she heard someone yell. "He's got her in there," Elias shouted. "He's killing her! Charge him!" The momentary lull was over. A new wave of attack began, more furious than before. They were trying to storm the cabin itself. Jed was forced to fall back, taking cover behind the porch railing. Clara dragged herself onto the cot, her body racked with contractions. The pain was blinding, all-consuming. But through it, a primal, fierce determination rose up. She would not let her baby be born into a world where these men won. She would not die here. She could hear Jed's ragged breathing just outside the door. She could hear the thud of bullets hitting the logs inches from his head. In between contractions, she screamed encouragement to him. "Jed, don't let them win! Fight!" Her scream seemed to give him new strength. He let out a roar of his own and unleashed a final, furious volley of fire. 2 more men went down, screaming in pain. The others, their nerve finally broken, began to retreat, dragging their wounded with them. The sound of their horses faded into the distance. Silence fell, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded men Jed had left scattered across the yard, and Clara's own ragged sobs of pain. The cabin door creaked open. Jed stumbled in, covered in dust and gunpowder, a bleeding gash on his forehead. He saw her on the bed, and his face, etched with the violence of the fight, softened into something else entirely. He rushed to her side, his calloused, blood-streaked hands finding hers. "It's time," she gasped, squeezing his hand with all her might. The world narrowed to the small, fire-lit cabin. The violence outside was forgotten, replaced by the raw, elemental struggle for life. Jed, the killer, the hermit, the protector, became a midwife. His deep voice, which had spit threats and commands just minutes before, was now a soft, steady murmur of encouragement. He boiled water. He tore strips from a clean sheet. He held her hand and wiped the sweat from her brow and told her to breathe. And as a wild storm broke outside, the sky weeping rain against the roof, the baby came. A raw, piercing cry cut through the sound of the thunder. A cry of life, a cry of victory. Jed lifted the small, slippery body and laid her on Clara's chest. It was a girl. A beautiful, perfect girl. Clara looked from her daughter's face to Jed's. His eyes were wet with tears. The killer was weeping. Mercy, Clara whispered, the name of prayer. Her name is Mercy. Jed nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He leaned down and kissed Clara's forehead, then his daughter's. At that moment, the cabin door was kicked open. Sheriff Finch stood there, his gun drawn, followed by two deputies. They took in the scene. The wounded men groaning outside, the bullet-riddled cabin, and the three people inside, a mother, a father, and a newborn child, huddled together in the aftermath of a war. Finch slowly lowered his gun, his face a mixture of awe and utter exhaustion. The fight was finally, truly over. The aftermath was quieter than the storm that preceded it. Sheriff Finch, faced with the undeniable evidence of an armed assault on Jed's land and the miracle of a newborn baby, made a choice. He arrested Elias Mayfield and the other ringleaders of the mob. The official story became one of drunken vigilantes taking the law into their own hands. Silas Mayfield's death was officially ruled an accidental drowning, the case closed for good. No one questioned Jed any further. The town, shamed and sobered by the events, wanted nothing more than to forget. Mrs. Langston tried to keep the whispers of witchcraft alive, but her words found little purchase. It's hard to call a woman a witch when she's nursing her baby on the porch of the general store. It's hard to call a man a demon when he's buying lumber to build a cradle. The town didn't forgive Clara and Jed. They simply made room for them. Their fear was replaced by a grudging, wary respect. They were survivors. They were a family. The ruling on the Mayfield land came by mail a few weeks later. As she had declared, the judge had ruled in her favor. Clara signed the deed over to the town doctor, a good man with a large family and little money, on the condition he never speak the Mayfield name on its soil again. She was cutting the last thread, freeing herself completely from the life that had almost destroyed her. Their own life on the ranch fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the needs of their daughter. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty or tense. It was filled with the soft sounds of a baby's breath, the creak of the rocking chair Jed built, and the low, gentle lullaby Clara would hum as she nursed Mercy. Jed taught Clara how to shoot. She taught him how to laugh. He never brought trophies home again. The hollow space under the floorboard in the barn was filled in with dirt and forgotten. The graves by the fence line were still there, a stark reminder of the man he had been, but they no longer held the same menace. They were just part of his story, the brutal chapter that had led him to her. One day, Clara planted wildflowers all around them, turning a place of violent justice into a garden. Years passed. Little Mercy grew, a wild and happy child with her mother's quiet strength and her father's watchful eyes. She learned the names of flowers before she learned her letters. She learned how to track a rabbit and how to knead dough. She grew up in a world of two people, a world of profound silence and even more profound love, a world where she was safe, cherished, and free. Clara's hair began to show threads of silver. The lines on Jed's face deepened, but his eyes, when he looked at her and their daughter, were always soft. The ranch thrived. They built another barn, a bigger garden. The roses she'd planted by the porch bloomed in a riot of defiant red every single spring. Sometimes on a cool evening, they would sit on the porch together, watching Mercy chase fireflies in the twilight. They rarely spoke of the past, of the rope and the river and the rage. They didn't need to. Their life together was the only answer that mattered. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something new, something strong, something beautiful. The world had once judged Clara Mayfield and cast her out, leaving her to choke on her own shame. They had called her barren, empty, a failure. But they were wrong. She wasn't a wasteland. She was the earth after a long drought, waiting for the right kind of rain. She had survived, she had healed, she had loved, and she had bloomed. If you've ever felt like your story was written for you by someone else, like your worth was measured by a standard you could never meet, I want you to remember Clara's story. You are not the shame they tried to give you. You are not the silence they tried to force upon you. You are the fire that refused to go out, the flower that grew in stone, the life that bloomed in the most unlikely of gardens. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival, justice, and the wild, untamable human spirit. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, stay strong and tell your own story.